Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about user input. Now, since the majority of my tutorials are going to be run on the command line, we're going to be focusing on keyboard user input for this video. So in order to accept keyboard input from a user, it's just a simple function. It's called the input function. The user input function returns the user input as a string. So in order to store it, we need to have the input function assign its returning result into a variable. So let's do a real basic example of an input. I'm going to create a variable. We're just going to call it x. And then I'm going to call our input function and then open close parentheses. So that's a very basic usage. We can pass a parameter into the input function if we like to help specify a prompt so that we can describe to the user what kind of input we're expecting. I am going to put something in here so that we can put in a prompt. So I'm going to just say something. And then we're going to print x after the fact to display our message. And now I'm going to run our program. So it's asking us to say something, and I'm going to type hello, and it'll print out hello. If I run it again, I'm going to type in some gibberish, hit enter, and it prints out some gibberish. The input function will stop accepting user input once you hit the enter button, as I've demonstrated in both of these runs. It will not include that enter inside your input though. It'll cut that off, so you don't have to worry about having to strip the enter button from whatever input you may have put in. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the input function returns everything as a string, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are restricted to just using strings with user input, because we have casting as well as other ways to convert data from one type to another. So let's say we want the user to input an integer so that we can use it in a mathematical equation. I'm going to change our prompt so that it will ask for an integer. And then real quick, I'm going to print out the type so you can see. And then we're going to cast x as an integer and store it back into itself. And then print out the type again. And then we're going to print out x plus 3. So we run that again. It asks for an integer. I'm going to type in 7 so that we should see 10 when it prints out. And see, it prints it out as the type string first. Then we cast it. Now it's an integer. And then we added it and we got 10. So as you can see, we're not restricted to what input returns. We can still convert it to whatever we want because it's just a simple string. We can still manipulate it and convert it to whatever we need it to be. However, when it comes to converting input, one of the most important things to learn along with accepting user input in any form, not just with the input function, is input checking. This is because the average user is going to be a typical human who is going to be prone to making mistakes or just not following directions. Or it could be a malicious entity that's trying to exploit your program to just cause it to crash or gain access to data or the system itself. So it's very important to add input checking into your programs. In this case, my program is just expecting an integer. But what happens if we enter something that's not an integer? Let's say I type in the letter T. It crashes because it can't convert the letter T into an integer. So we have to add some input checking to protect that. So I'm going to clear these lines here. And we're going to add a bit of input checking before we perform our actual function. So the first thing we need to do is check to see if x can be converted into an integer. Fortunately, the string object has a function that allows us to do just that. It is the isNumeric function. IsNumeric will check to see if the string is all numbers. And as long as it is all numbers, no letters, no decimals, it will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. And this is perfect in this case because we don't want the user to enter in floats. While it may not have a huge impact in this particular program, in other programs where you're fully expecting to have an integer and not a float, it's very important to make sure that you don't let them put in a float. So we're going to use the isNumeric. So we're going to say if x.isNumeric, we're going to cast x as an integer and store it back into itself. Then we're going to print x plus 3. Then we're going to add an else to say hey, you did not type in an integer. Let's make it actually print out the value of x. So we're going to type in a letter first to test to make sure that our input checking is working properly. So I'm going to type in t, and it says that t is not an integer. So that's good. It's catching non-numeric values. So now we're going to type in 3.5. Let's see if it can catch that the float is not an integer. 3.5 is not an integer. So cool. It catches that too. Now we're going to type in 7, and we get 10. So it works. We got some basic input checking. It only adds the number if it's an integer, and it'll print out the result. Otherwise, it'll say that's not an integer. But input checking is not limited to just checking the data type. There are all kinds of things we can look for in our input, and it really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're expecting the user to put in. We can check to see if it's all numeric, all alphabetic. We can check to see if the length is there. We can check to see if maybe we want them to enter in a list of things, in which case we want to make sure that they are comma separated and there's no spaces or something like that. There's all kinds of things we can check for this. And it all depends on just what you need your program to do. Do you need it to manipulate the data directly? Or are you preparing to store it in a data structure or something and it needs to be stored in a specific way? And when it comes to proper input checking, you have to really utilize everything we've so far covered with Python, as well as many things we'll cover in the future as well. Well, not just with Python, with any language really. You have to really utilize everything you know in order to perform proper input checking. Okay, so now we're going to do something new. We're going to do an exercise. This is something I've been wanting to do for a while, but I wanted to wait until we had covered enough material in order to do a proper exercise. So I feel like we're at that point now where we can do a simple exercise. And I'll be doing a bunch more of these in the future as well for other topics, and even dedicate full videos just to be an exercise. So in this exercise, we've got a list of pilots. So it's a list of tuples and it's got pilot information. It's got a name, it's got a 6-digit number for their ID number, it's got their type of ship, and it's got the name of their ship. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple text-based menu that will provide 3 options. The first one will be to add a pilot to the list. The second one will be to remove a pilot from the list. And the third one will be to print out the pilot information. And then of course there'll be a fourth default option, Q to quit the program. Now, because we have all these conditions and all these things to check for when it comes to input, we're going to use a while loop, but we're just going to say while true because we're going to have a bunch of conditions and stuff inside the while loop that will be checking the input. So we don't need the while loop to check the input for us. So I'll type while true. And we're going to start with printing out the menu. So option 1, add new pilot. Option 2, remove existing pilot. Option 3, print pilot info. Okay, now we're going to put in our input. For our variable, I think we should just call it something straightforward and understandable to tell the coder what it is we're doing. It's always important to make your code clear what it is you're doing and what it is certain things are representing, especially variables. So we're going to call our variable choice. Make a menu selection or Q to quit. Okay, so we've got our menu and we've got our input prompt. Now we need to set up some if statements to handle the input after the fact. Now, fortunately, we don't have to do any casting with the user input. It just has to stay a string. We're not using the input directly. We're just running it through a couple of if statements to say, hey, did he type this? Did he type this? Or did he type this? So we don't really need to cast it as an integer for this menu. We'll start with the default one though. If choice equals Q, we'll break out of the loop. Now we're going to have it check for when we enter in 1. So choice 1 is to add a new pilot. So we're going to have a couple of input statements in here. And I know that I just went over input checking and stuff like that, but to keep this example simple and the code readable so that you guys can follow along, we're just going to pretend that there's input checking here, but I want to keep this simple and just take in the input. So first we need the pilot name. Pilot ID, I'm going to call it PID because ID is actually a function in Python. Next up, the ship type. And then finally, the ship name. So once we've collected this data, we now need to store it in the list. And since the list is a list of tuples, we have to put the data in a tuple and then add that tuple to the list. We're going to do that in one line. So pilot list dot append to add an item to the list. And inside we're going to add a second set of parentheses so that we can create our tuple. And we're going to put the name variable in there. We're going to cast PID as an integer. Then the ship type, followed by the ship name. And there we go. So we've got our tuple being added to the list. Now we have to handle choice 2, which is to remove a pilot from the list. And we're just going to say enter pilot ID. We'll remove it by the ID. And then we'll cast PID into an int and store it back into itself. And then we're going to open up a for loop for x in range, the length of pilot list. And the reason we're doing it this way is because we're modifying the list itself by deleting an item from the list. So we want to go through the range of indexes, not through the list itself. If pilot list x, so that's going to pull up the tuple, and we can further specify another index, and that index will be applied to the tuple. So since the ID is the second element in the tuple, that means it'll be at index of 1. So we will specify 1 here. So what we're saying here is, in the list at index of x, look at that tuple at the index of 1, which will be the pilot ID. And then we will compare it to the pilot ID we entered. And if they match, delete the tuple inside pilot list at index of x. And then if we found it and we deleted the item, we'll type break to break out of the for loop because there's no point to continue looping through the list if we've already found it. And finally, we've got choice 3. So in this one, we're going to ask for the pilot ID again, and then we're going to go through the list to find that pilot ID and then print out the tuple. And we're not going to get fancy with it. We're just going to directly print out the tuple. The majority of that we can actually accomplish by just copying the lines from choice 2. So to save time in typing, we're going to copy these lines. But instead of deleting, we're going to print x, and then we'll break. So there you have it. We've got our menu, we've got our choices, our default is Q, we have 1 which will allow us to add a new pilot, we have 2 that will allow us to remove a pilot, and then we have 3 which will print out pilot information. But we are missing one thing. There is one more condition we need to check for. Consider it like the default. If none of these things match, we need to warn the user invalid choice because we typed something in here that was not supposed to go in here. So now let's make this bigger so we can see the whole thing. Python exercise 1. So we've got our list. So let's add a pilot first. We're going to say crow. Pilot ID will be 998877. Something simple. Ship type, frigate. Ship name, Eagle. And we don't get any feedback because we didn't code any feedback, but it was added to the list. Now we're going to remove a pilot. And we're going to remove the first one, which was pilot ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we're going to print out pilot info. Now, if I type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, nothing gets printed out because it's no longer on the list. So let's try choice 3 again. And we're going to try our new pilot, 998877. And it prints out our tuple. We'll print out the other pilots too. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Prints out Beth. 3 again. And then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it prints out Aaron. And then we press Q to quit. And that was our first exercise. Pretty fun, right? Like I said, I'm going to do more of these in the future, as well as include them in their own dedicated videos, not just in videos where we cover topics. So I hope to do a lot more of these, and I hope you guys will enjoy them and learn from them. And that's it for user input. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. And if you did, then please hit the like button and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. If you want to see more, head on over to Wayfair Coding Academy channel to check out my other content. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on new stuff as it comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.